When Sekiro Shadows Die Twice was originally released in 2019, there was an extraordinary amount of interest as a result of the game's initial announcements. Both critics and gamers were equally excited for the unique premise of a Japanese From Software experience. However, soon after the game's release, the interest turned into criticism. But the speculative scenario is this: why was the parrying method from Sekiro so frustrating and controversial? After From Software completed work on Bloodborne, released in 2015 on its later expansion The Old Hunters, From Software decided to make Sekiro unlike anything that had ever been released by From Software up until that particular time, as developers and producers looked to the Tenchu franchise of games that From Software was affiliated with. Eventually, the decision was to have the game become something of a spiritual successor to the Tenchu series, but later became an individual game in its own right. The director of Sekiro, Hidetaka Miyazaki, intended the combat of the game on gaming dynamics to be a unique experience. In other words, quote-unquote, swords clashing between characters. From information now known, the combat system, later known by popular opinions as the quote-unquote Sekiro Parry or the quote-unquote Sekiro Parrying system, was Hidetaka Miyazaki's personalized interpretation of traditional Japanese swords play, as from dialogue mentioned by characters during the game on tutorials available for players to learn from the parrying system, is the main focus of combat to fight against enemies and bosses throughout the playthrough of Sekiro. Hidetaka Miyazaki on From Software intended players to use in-game skill enhancements or items, timing even, but most importantly skill, to use weapons to attack enemies and to block attacks when appropriate as well. Miyazaki's initial concepts of swords clashing was expanded to a sword fight with fatigue by either player or enemy, building through an appropriate bar to represent the battle's progressions. And once the said bar was filled, a lethal strike was available to both the player and enemy to inflict massive or even fatal amounts of damage. While the combat dynamics were thought of to be a realistic interpretation of Japanese swords play like Miyazaki envisioned, soon after Sekiro's release there was an extraordinary amount of criticism about the parrying system. Enhancements that could aid the player in-game didn't necessarily make the parrying experience easier. Even the skills needed to properly execute parries when the moment arose during heated combat was far more frustrating than From Software had envisioned it to be. Miyazaki's interpretations of Japanese swords play seemed appropriate for a slow, calculated and arguably calm environment. A one-on-one matchup between the said player and an opponent. Critics of the time called the difficulty relating to the parrying experience or even using the parrying system to be quote-unquote brutal. Further complaints had the parry system against multiple enemies or stronger bosses later in the game to be extraordinarily difficult, daring to mention that the parrying system was broken and affected the interpretation of the game itself by players. In 2020, Ghost of Tsushima was released and received pivotal acclaim from both critics and gamers. Due to Sekiro being released slightly more than a year previously, inevitable discussions from both critics and players compare the methods of combat between enemies and bosses as being a sharp contrast. Sekiro's method of parrying and Tsushima's method of parrying were similar yet different due to difficulty and environment, even use of in-game effects, items or skill. Sekiro was overwhelmingly parrying based. Tsushima had parrying but items on fluidity, so while Tsushima had parrying to actually be an important premise of the game, it wasn't as frustrating or even conflictive as Sekiro was. Due to the parrying system of Sekiro being absolutely pivotal to the game's dynamics, it's now known that a fair amount of players who experienced the game were unable to complete it from the frustrations and complaints encountered within the gaming experience. Conflicting sources mention that there were even complaints to patch in or patch out features of the parrying system to make it more accessible to less skilled or casual players. Due to the parrying system developed, it was somewhat impossible to truly change the timing or skill needed to properly or effectively use the system. As a result, Sekiro is now considered to be one of the most difficult From Software Souls-like games ever conceived. With everything considered, there was praise for the Sekiro parrying method. As with Sifu, which was originally released in 2022, it used a method of combat between the player and enemies, as critics and gamers referred to it as a modified and, more importantly, slightly easier to use Sekiro method of parrying. Sifu was the first major game after the release of Sekiro to use a variation of the Sekiro parrying method, and critics mentioned that Miyazaki's parrying style could work, but it was a shame that it wasn't necessarily appreciated or even fully understood, perhaps most importantly tolerated during its original era of implementation.